No one must have any private property whatsoever, except what is absolutely necessary. Secondly, no one must have any lodging or storehouse at all, which is not open to all comers. They must live in common, attending in messes as if they were in the field. They alone of all in the city dare not have any dealings with gold or silver, or even touch them, or come under the same roof with them. What is being described here? Is this a description of an ascetic religious order, or of a communist group in training for a secret mission? Or is it a science fiction account of a society of the future preparing for a space war? It is actually Plato's account of the Republic, his ideal Republic. Plato, the philosopher of ancient Athens, is the most celebrated, honored, revered, and adored of any philosopher who has ever lived. He lived 24 centuries ago, in the 4th century before Christ, and all through history since then, the praise of Plato has been expressed in figures of speech which compete with one another in their eloquence. He is said to be the greatest of the philosophers which Western civilization has ever produced. He is said to be the father of Western philosophy, the son of the god Apollo, a sublime dramatist and poet with a vision of beauty which embraces all human life, a mystic who before Christ and St. Paul beheld a transcendent realm of spirit, of goodness, love, and beauty. And he is said to be the greatest of the moralists and social philosophers of all time. The famous British philosopher and mathematician, Alfred North Whitehead, said of Plato, "The history of Western philosophy is only a set of footnotes to Plato." And the great American poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Plato, "Plato is philosophy, and philosophy Plato." And he also said, "Out of Plato come all things that are still written and debated among men of thought." Aside from the great achievements of his philosophy, Plato's life exhibits many tragic conflicts and deep frustrations, which arose from the larger tragedy which developed and overcame Athens herself, her defeat in war, and the subsequent decline of the great civilization which was Athens. To understand Plato, we must place him in his culture and in his time. He is born into 5th century Athens in 427 BC, and he died in 347 BC when he was 80 years old. He was born at the end of what is called the Golden Age of Athens, or is sometimes called the Age of Heraclitus, who was its statesman ruler. The Golden Age of Athens, the Age of Pericles, which lasted from 445 to 431 BC, has come to be the very symbol of perfection in human civilized life. It may be said that the Western world has had a long-standing love affair with Athens of the Golden Age. We feel closer to Athens as our ideal and model than to any other city in all of human history, except possibly Jerusalem. But our relationship to Jerusalem is not as an ideal city, but it is only a devotion to the great persons who lived there and to the sacred events that happened there. Why the long love affair with the Golden Age of ancient Athens? She is our ideal as a democracy, and as a city devoted to human excellence in mind and body, and to the humane cultivation of the art of living. And we empathize with her in her tragic defeat. By the 5th century BC, Athens had become a democracy, as the culmination of a long struggle between a small number of land-owning families of the aristocracy and great numbers of the poor. Pericles, with great skill, maintained political rights for all, for the aristocracy and for commoners, for rich and for poor, although not for slaves. He was elected annually as the first citizen of the state. Pericles extended and consolidated the empire of the Athenian city-state, while strengthening within Athens the new political doctrine of egalitarianism, of equal rights for all under the law. Most of the prominent and influential citizens of Athens were democratic, or had become democratic in their political views. The poor were held to be as virtuous and as capable as the rich. The Greek playwright Aeschylus wrote in one of his famous plays, "Justice shines in houses grimy with smoke." And the philosopher Pythagoras said, "Anyone who is just and reverent is qualified to give advice on public affairs. The state had a constitution and a Supreme Court, which had a jury system of 6,000 jurors divided into panels, and which formed the basis of Athenian democracy. All citizens were equal under the law, equal in educational opportunity and in political life through direct democratic debate and voting. There was freedom of speech and humane treatment of aliens and slaves. In the age of Pericles, there was full employment and great material prosperity through trade and domestic industry. The city government was viewed as coming close to being a model of justice, and Athenians felt intense loyalty for the city itself. The years 445 to 431 BC were years of peace and internal improvements. Under Pericles, Athens was made beautiful by vast building projects. Historians of comparative civilization say no other city was ever so adorned by temples, public buildings, and works of art. Today, the remains of temples and public buildings, adorned by magnificent sculptures and statuary, still stand. Outstanding among these are the Parthenon, which was the chief temple of Athens, dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, whose huge gold and ivory statue was carved under the direction of the sculptor Phidias. The Parthenon and the Propylaea, the great entrance hall, were among the set of public buildings high on a rock cliff called the Acropolis, overlooking the city. Pericles attracted to Athens the intellectually and the artistically gifted of all parts of Greece. In literature, there appeared the great Greek dramatists, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. In architecture and sculpture, there were Phidias and Mnesicles. In philosophy, there were Zeno and Anaxagoras, the Sophists, and Socrates. In history, there were the great historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. There were brilliant achievements in all fields of culture, science, and medicine. The historian Thucydides writes that Pericles, in his famous oration of the first year of the war, said of the Athenians, "We are lovers of the beautiful, yet simple in our tastes, and we cultivate the mind without loss of manliness." Pericles' moderate policy in time ran into opposition by extremists on both the aristocratic right and the democratic left. But a strong sense of loyalty to Athens unified her politically when war broke out in the spring of 431 BC, the famous Peloponnesian War with Sparta. At this time, most of the communities of Greece were under the leadership of either the Athenian Empire, which was democratic, commercial, and industrial, or the Spartan Empire, which was authoritarian, militaristic, and agricultural. The war as it developed became clearly a struggle between Athenian democracy and the military authoritarianism of Sparta, ruled by a military elite with absolute unchecked political power. In the second year of the war, a plague broke out in Athens, which was overcrowded and without medical knowledge to control the plague, and which was increasingly impoverished. We in the United States at the present time cannot help identifying with the plight of democratic Athens against her enemy Sparta because of our own struggle against militarism and against totalitarianism throughout the 20th century. Both authoritarian ancient Sparta and modern totalitarian governments are examples of political absolutism, the rule by a single person or by a small elite group with absolute unchecked political power. Democratic Athens finally surrendered to Sparta in 404 BC, whereupon a revolution was staged by the aristocrats, who conducted a vicious reign of terror, now known to us as the Rule of the 30. Among the leaders of this reign of terror were Parmenides, who was Plato's uncle, and Critias, who was Plato's cousin. They represented the rich and noble families who had been virtually impoverished and destroyed by the long years of war waged by democratic Athens. When democracy was restored and the Rule of the 30 brought to an end, the philosopher Socrates was tried by an Athenian jury and was sentenced to death. What do we know of Plato's life during the long war with Sparta? Plato was born 3 years after the war with Sparta began. He had never known the peace and glory of the golden age of Pericles. He was the son of aristocratic parents. His father was descended from the last king of Athens. His mother was a descendant of Solon, the aristocratic lawgiver and reformer who had written the constitution for Athenian democracy. Both sides of his family were related to noble and wealthy landowners of Athens, whose sympathies during the war increasingly opposed the flounderings of the democratic government. Plato was brought up to think of democracy as a form of corruption in government, and he believed that an armed counter-revolution appeared to be the only solution to the weakness of Athens against the power and strength of Sparta. And he also believed that his relatives, such as Parmenides and Critias, would be able to bring about a new political order, and that Socrates could provide its philosophy. Plato was 28 years old at the time of the trial of Socrates, which is perhaps the most famous trial in all of history. Plato had been studying with Socrates for 8 years as his student, although he had known Socrates as a friend of the family since his earliest childhood. In the dramatic dialogue called the Apology, Plato presents Socrates' own speech in his defense at his trial. Plato's account of the trial is believed to be substantially accurate. Plato was present at the trial of his teacher, and he circulated his own account of the trial after it had taken place in order to combat other accounts of the trial which were unfriendly to the cause of Socrates. What were the charges which the Athenians brought against Socrates? He was charged with atheism, with impiety, with speaking against the gods, and he was also charged with corrupting the youth of Athens. In fact, however, the real charges were unmentionable, because in an effort to put an end to the bitter hatreds developed in Athens during the war, the government had banned any public mention of specific war crimes. But the actual crimes of Socrates, which the Athenians wished to charge him with, but were unable to mention, were that Socrates, with the aid of his friends, Parmenides and Critias, and of his favorite pupil, Alcibiades, who was perhaps the greatest traitor that Athens had ever had conspired to bring about a counter-revolution against the Athenian democracy during the war, and that Socrates was continuing to incite the noble young men of Athens to revolt against the democratic government, even now after the end of the war and the defeat of Athens in 404. The purpose of the trial was to frighten Socrates away from Athens, so that he would not continue by his philosophizing in public places to weaken the morale of the exhausted democracy by his constant criticisms of it. The Athenians had no desire to impose a death sentence upon him, nor do they wish to make a martyr of him. As Plato himself brings out in the Apology, Socrates could have avoided death by leaving Athens before the trial began, as was customary at that time when acquittal in a trial appeared to be doubtful. Moreover, even if he had not left before the trial, he would have been acquitted if he had shown any deference to the democratic feelings of the public and of the jury, or if at least he had not openly shown his contempt for them. He would have been acquitted despite the contempt which his speech exhibited for the Athenian public and for democracy, if he had proposed, when requested, a moderate fine for himself. And finally, in the absence of any of these means by which he would have avoided the death sentence, he could easily have escaped after his sentence, since he was detained for a month before he had to drink the hemlock, and no one would have blamed him for escaping. But Socrates will not compromise with his view that he has been the benefactor of the Athenian public. To escape or to propose any penalty or fine, however trivial, would be to admit guilt. Moreover, when his friends begged him to allow them to arrange the escape, he argues that it would be legally and morally wrong to escape, since every citizen of a state has entered into a social contract to obey its laws. And he also argues that individuals who disobey the laws of their own society tear away at the foundation of group life. Socrates, in his speech, takes his stand upon the abstract principles of his philosophy. This is his apology, his defense of himself. It is for the truth of his philosophy that he is willing to die. It is for the truth of his philosophy that he will not consent to be conciliatory to the judges or to the jury, or to suggest a milder punishment than death, Thus he forces them to put him to death. But what was this philosophy for which he chose to die, rather than to renounce it? The main points which he himself brings out, as Plato recounts his speech at the trial, are these. First, the only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. He says this because the famous oracle at the shrine of Apollo at Delphi had said that no man living was wiser than Socrates. So, says Socrates to the jury, I wanted to test what the oracle had said in order to prove that it was false. And so first I went to the statesmen, he says in his speech, and I found that those whose reputation for wisdom was the very highest were in fact the most lacking in wisdom. And I knew, said Socrates, that I was wiser than the statesmen because at least I knew that I knew nothing. And then he said I went to the poets to see if some of the poets were not wiser than I. But I soon found out that they create their poetry not by wisdom, but by inspiration, like prophets who say many fine things, but understand nothing of what they say. But the poets thought that they were the wisest of men, in all other matters too, because of their poetry. And then he said I went to the craftsmen, to the artisans, and I found out that they indeed did know many fine things that I did not know, like how to build ships or how to make shoes. But like the poets, they believed themselves to be wise in matters of the greatest importance because of the skill that they had in their own craft, such as shoemaking. This tended to diminish the real knowledge that they did have. And so, said Socrates, I concluded, after discovering that wisdom cannot be found among the statesmen, among the poets, or the craftsmen, that what the oracle at Delphi meant was, not that Socrates is wise, but that he at least knows that he really knows nothing. Socrates' second philosophic point in his apology is that the improvement of the soul, the care for wisdom and truth, what he calls the tendance of the soul, is the highest good. Not until you have pursued wisdom and truth, he says, ought you to think of money or fame or prestige or of the body. Wealth does not bring excellence, he says, but from excellence comes wealth and every other good thing. This is why I go about, he says, persuading old and young alike, not to be concerned with yourselves or with your properties, but first and foremost to care about the improvement of your soul. This, says Socrates, is my teaching. And if this is the doctrine which corrupts the youth, then I am indeed a mischievous person. And if anyone says that I teach anything else, he lies. Socrates' third point is to say to the Athenians that if you condemn me, you will sin against the gods who have given me to you. I am a gadfly, he says, whom God gave to the state of Athens, which is like a great and noble horse, sluggish and slow in its motions because of its great size. And the horse needs to be stirred into life by my sting. This is why all day and at all places I am always alighting upon you to sting you, to arouse and to reproach you. You will not easily find another like me, he says, and therefore I would advise you to spare me. The fourth and the most important point in Socrates' speech is the philosophic principle that virtue is knowledge. According to this principle, that virtue is knowledge, to know the good is to do the good. Evil, wrongdoing, or vice, these are due to the lack of knowledge, to ignorance, and to nothing else. If virtue is knowledge, and if to know the good is to do the good, then wrongdoing comes only from failure to know what is good. And so in a famous line, Socrates says, no one does evil voluntarily. That is, knowing the good, no man would voluntarily choose evil. But do we not often say, I acted against my better judgment, or I really knew better? According to Socrates, this is absurd, because if you really did know better, if you really understood the right thing to do, you would have done it. If you really had better judgment than you used, you would have acted on it and not against it. Socrates insists that when one does an evil act, it is always with the thought that it will bring one some good, some benefit. A thief knows that stealing is wrong, but he steals the gold ring anyway, believing that it will impress his girlfriend and will bring him sexual pleasure. So also people spend their lives striving for power or prestige or wealth, thinking that one of these is good and will make them happy. But they do not know what is good. They do not know that these are not good and will not bring them happiness. One needs to know human nature, the true nature of human beings, in order to know what is good for humans and what will bring you happiness, and so how to live and what to strive for. And not to examine this, not to delve into this, never to know what is the good for human beings, is to live a life of endless striving to achieve, but never finding happiness. Such a life he calls unexamined. And in one of his most famous lines, Socrates declares that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates' view of virtue, of what is right and what is good, may be called a rationalistic moral philosophy. A rationalistic moral philosophy is a philosophic view which claims that reason or rationality is the exclusive or the dominant factor in moral conduct. It is, as Socrates himself says, the claim that to know the good is to do the good. Do you agree that to know the good is to do it? Most moderns do not agree. They would not agree that even if I possess a true knowledge of human nature, of how to live, of what to strive for, of what will bring me happiness, that there is any assurance that with this knowledge of what is good, I will act upon it and do the good. We moderns have learned too much about all the non-rational forces in human personality which combat reason and which reason has to contend with, instincts, emotions, passions, and drives, to which reason is always taking second place. The Latin poet Ovid said, "We know and approve the better course, but follow the worse." And as for Freud and for contemporary psychiatry, there is the unconscious, which is a seething cauldron of powerful desires, against which reason is weak, if not utterly helpless. These were the main points of the Socratic philosophy that appeared at the trial. The outcome of the trial is, of course, the sentencing of Socrates to drink the poison hemlock, and this he does in the presence of his sorrowing friends, who had come in a final effort to persuade him to escape. It is Plato who is the first to offer the view of Socrates as a martyr, in the line with which Plato ends another one of his dialogues called the Phaedo, in which he says, "And that was the end of our friend, who was, we may say, of all those of his time whom we have known, the best and wisest and the most righteous man." There are many who have come to think of the martyrdom of Socrates as the secular counterpart of the martyrdom of Christ. The analogy with Christ is that the best among us, the wisest, the noblest, the purest, the most righteous, is put to death by us. But this is only one of the many interpretations that have been made of Socrates' trial and death. By contrast with seeing Socrates as a martyr, there are those philosophers who see Socrates' trial and death as representing the hostility toward philosophy and toward philosophers by the ignorant masses in a democracy. Another interpretation is made by political scientists who see Socrates' trial and death as expressing the power of the state over the individual and his freedom of inquiry. Still another interpretation is that of the sociologists who see Socrates' philosophy as a mask for his defense of aristocracy against Athenian democracy. Which of these interpretations do you find the most appropriate? Is Socrates martyred for his purity? Is he hated for his intelligence? Is he destroyed in his free individuality by the oppressive power of the state? Or is he a masked defender of aristocracy who came into conflict with a democratic government? After the death of Socrates in 399 BC, Plato left Athens with some of his close friends, not only out of sorrow for his teacher, but also because he too might be in danger from the democratic government of Athens. The most important event in his travels was his going to Syracuse, a wealthy and independent Greek city in the Mediterranean. The brother-in-law of the king of Syracuse, Dion, became completely devoted to Plato and his philosophy. There is a story that the king became enraged with Plato's influence upon Dion and ordered Plato sold into slavery. Plato, however, was ransomed by a friend and managed to return to Athens. On his return to Athens, Plato purchased some property outside the city walls in a place known as the Grove of Academus. There Plato started his famous school, which has come to be called the Academy, and where for the remaining 40 years of his life he taught and wrote many of his great works. The Academy was a school and an institute for philosophic and scientific research. His students were young men and women of the noble classes from all over Greece who were intending to have a political career. The Academy was the direct forerunner of the medieval and the modern university. For 900 years, the Academy was the outstanding school in the world. After 20 years there, in which Plato taught and wrote many of his great philosophic works, at the age of 60, he returned to Syracuse at the request of Dion. The king of Syracuse had died, and Dion saw a chance for Plato to educate in philosophy the new young king, Dionysius II. And Dion wrote to Plato, "Now, if ever, is there a good chance that your own ideal can be realized, and true philosophy and power over a great dominion be united in the same person. Here, as we shall see, is the concept of the philosopher king, of the philosopher who becomes king, or of the king who learns philosophy. This is a Platonic concept of vast influence throughout Western history. But Plato's return to Syracuse proved again to be a failure, and he returned to Athens and to the Academy, where he continued teaching until the age of 80, when in 348 BC he died. In the book called The Republic, Plato offered a blueprint for an ideal government of an ideal society. What was this philosopher's conception of the best kind of society and the best kind of government? This is the question which we have foreshadowed and to which we will now turn.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.
We have seen that Plato, the father of Western philosophy, despised democracy as a form of government. It is not hard to understand why, knowing what we do about what had happened during the war to Athenian democracy and to the noble and wealthy class to which Plato belonged. Athenian democracy had sunk into moral corruption, into muddle-headed confusion and disorganization. And as for the wealthy classes, they had supported the democracy. They had paid for the war effort, and now they saw themselves financially wiped out because of the democratic government's bungling of the war. After the death of Socrates, Plato was more than ever convinced that a democratic state, a state ruled by the many, is doomed to disaster, because, he believed, the many can never know what is good for the state, and for these reasons. The many lack the necessary level of intelligence and training. They are concerned only with their own immediate pleasures and gratifications, and they are ruled by unstable, volatile emotions which render them easy prey to clever demagogues or to mob passions. Plato believed that such a government, a democratic government run by the many, cannot produce good human beings, and in turn he believed that good people would find life impossible under a democratic government. Do Plato's attacks upon democratically governed cities make you uncomfortable? Is he touching a raw nerve? What about your own city and its democratic government? Or what about the democratic government of the United States? 2,400 years ago, did Plato tell it like it is? Having arrived at these conclusions about democracy, Plato withdrew from the public life of Athens. He saw that the real challenge was to philosophy, to provide a true definition of justice, a philosophy of a just and good society, and a theory of the best form of government for such a society. And so he came to pin his hopes on the possibility of a society governed by a philosopher king who would have knowledge of true justice and the best form of government. Plato developed the theory that not until philosophers became kings, or kings became philosophers, with the same person uniting within himself knowledge and power, would a society based upon justice be possible. In order to accomplish this goal, Plato saw his own task as the development of a true philosophy and the education of potential philosopher kings in his academy. In pursuing these goals, Plato takes it to be his mission in life to carry on the philosophic work of Socrates. From the point of view of their respective personalities, this was a strange alliance. Plato, the aristocrat, quiet, reserved, aloof from the democratic scene at Athens, cold, a literary artist as well as a philosopher, using philosophy to serve the ideals of excellence of his social class. And on the other hand, Socrates, middle class in origin, gregarious, a mixer with all types and classes in the city, short and stocky of build, pudgy and ugly of face, with bulging eyes and broad nostrils. But his intellectual brilliance, his wit and good humor, were able, nevertheless, to win the love of any young man of Athens who happened to strike his homosexual fancy. All of Plato's philosophic writing was done in the form of dialogues, conversations, in which almost always the principal speaker is Socrates. These are the first philosophical dialogues of the Western world. So far as we know, Plato himself invented the dialogue as a literary form. Most of the dialogues use the philosophic method which Socrates invented, the Socratic method, sometimes called the method of dialectic, sometimes called the elenchus, which means boxing in. It is a form of seeking knowledge by question and answer. Socrates opens up a conversation with someone, and catching him off guard, puts a question to him about his work or his main interests. Usually it is a general question of the form, what is courage? What is piety? What is justice? This forces the respondent to answer with a definition. For example, justice is paying your debts. Socrates then proceeds to refute each definition by offering a counterexample designed to show that the definition which was offered is too narrow, too limited, or that it is biased or uninformed. You can see the Socratic method beautifully at work in Book 1 of the Republic. Socrates asks Cephalus, a wealthy and honorable old merchant, what is justice? Cephalus replies from the point of view of the ethics of a businessman. Justice is speaking the truth and paying one's debts. But Socrates replies with a counterexample. Sometimes paying one's debts may be unjust. For example, when you owe a friend a weapon, but since then he has become insane, would it not be unjust to return it to him? Cephalus agrees. His own definition is demolished, A new and larger definition must be constructed to cover this type of case. A definition must be able to cover all examples. A definition must state what all the cases, all the examples, instances, particulars have in common, as examples of courage or justice, etc. Socrates believed that by this Socratic method, in which each succeeding question corrects what was wrong with the previous definition, that finally a true definition could be coaxed out of anyone. He saw himself as a midwife helping with the birth of a baby, the true definition, coming out of the mind of the respondent. What was the philosophic significance of the Socratic method? For Socrates, definition is the foundation of knowledge and morality. Definition, which is what the Socratic method achieves, gives us the true and enduring meaning of our concepts, such as justice, man, courage. And these definitions give us as well true moral ideas or standards by which to live. Plato's primary intention as a philosopher was to find definitions for the following concepts. What is the best type of state? What kind of government is just? What is justice? These questions led him into more fundamental questions, such as what is knowledge? What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of the physical world? What is the highest good for human beings? What is virtue or right conduct? How then did Plato go about constructing his philosophy? Like all philosophers who came after him, he philosophized in response to what had been thought by philosophers in the past. Plato built not only upon the philosophy of Socrates, but also upon the philosophies of earlier philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. The earliest philosophers of the Greek world of the 6th century had wrestled with the problem of explaining physical nature by asking, what is the one basic physical material out of which the world is made? They all agreed that the many different kinds of things we see in the world are all changes, transformations of only one kind of thing. But they disagreed as to what the one fundamental material out of which the many are formed is. Is it water, or air, or fire? In this way, a second major philosophic problem took shape, the problem of change, of the transformations of the one into the many. Does the one change into the many? Then how is it one? Are the many all merely variations, transformations, changes of the permanent, unchanging one? Then how are they many? The two sides of this debate were carried on by two outstanding pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus was a solitary, pessimistic member of the nobility of the city of Ephesus. Heraclitus argued that the fundamental character of reality is change itself. Everything in reality, said Heraclitus, is in process, in flux, is changing. He wrote, one cannot step twice into the same river, since it is endlessly flowing, changing, moving with fresh waters. By claiming that everything is change or flux, Heraclitus denied that anything can stay the same, that anything can be identical with what it has been or what it will be, and thus he denied any permanence, any immutability in the world. He denied the unchanging one and affirmed the changing many. But in the fiercest opposition to Heraclitus stood Parmenides of Elea in southern Italy, who wrote his philosophy in the form of poetry. Parmenides argued that not change, but permanence is the fundamental character of reality. Reality, he said, is unitary, single, permanent, unchanging. How can a thing change into something else? How can it be and not be? Whatever is must be what it is, identical with itself, unchanging. Parmenides therefore claimed that reality is a single, unchanging one, and he branded change as an illusion. He denied that anything can change. He denied any process or development in the world. He denied the many and affirmed the one. Change is mere appearance to the senses, Parmenides was saying, whereas truth is unchanging and is known by reason. One response to this philosophic conflict between Heraclitus and Parmenides was that of the Sophists. The Sophists were philosophers from many different societies outside Greece who traveled about from city to city and came to Athens in the 5th century BC, where they made a reputation as teachers of rhetoric, the art of making persuasive public speeches. The art of rhetoric was enormously useful in order to achieve success in politics in democratic Athens, in which debate in the public assembly was open to all citizens. The Sophists announced that since reason produced such conflicting claims as those of Heraclitus and Parmenides, one has to doubt the power of reason to lead to truth at all, and thus the Sophists became the first exponents of skepticism, the philosophic position of doubting the possibility of any true knowledge. And so the Sophists threw suspicion upon all preceding Greek philosophical attempts to discover the true nature of reality. But more importantly, the Sophists may be said to have turned Greek philosophy in a new direction, away from the older philosophizing about the physical universe and toward the study of human beings and their moral, social, and political life. The Sophists were intellectual sophisticates who had traveled about a great deal. They knew many different cultures and their differing customs, their differing morals, laws, and governments. Much to the dismay of many Athenian citizens who believed that traditional Athenian morals, laws, and democracy were absolute truths of which they were very proud, the Sophists denied that the moral ideals of Athens were absolute truths. The Sophists were moral relativists, and they argued that all moral beliefs are relative to the group which believes them. No moral belief has any absolute truth. Moreover, the Sophists claimed that the laws of cities are not natural and unchangeable, but are merely the product of custom or convention. Therefore, some of the more radical Sophists argued one is not obliged to obey the law. One should obey the law only if it is to your advantage to do so. In Book 1 of the Republic, Thrasymachus, the sophist, argues that might makes right, that laws serve only to protect the interests of the powerful, of the ruling party. And therefore, he concludes, only a fool obeys the law if it is not to his advantage to do so. There are many people in our contemporary world who are very close to the Sophists in their beliefs. Like the Sophists, many of us are skeptics, doubtful about any claims to knowledge, especially when authorities are in conflict and the authorities fight among themselves, for example, at the present time, on how to teach children to read or on how to stop economic inflation. Like the Sophists, there are some who claim that the laws protect only the rich and powerful, that they are not based upon justice and therefore need not be obeyed. And many people today are moral relativists who deny that morality is valid other than for the group which believes in it. Do you agree with the Sophists? Socrates and Plato found the skepticism and the moral relativism of the Sophists so hateful that there is considerable doubt that the Sophist views were given a fair presentation in Plato's writing. The Sophist claims were in head-on collision with Socrates and Plato. Socrates and Plato defended reason and argued that reason does indeed provide true knowledge of reality and a true and absolute morality. How could the Sophist skepticism and moral relativism be answered? How could the dispute between Heraclitus and Parmenides about permanence and change be solved? The way in which Plato solves these problems is to identify what is true, what is legitimate in each conflicting philosophy, and to marshal the strengths of each philosophy into a single, unified, original philosophy of his own. Plato stands forth in the history of philosophy as one of the great synthesizers of the past conflicts of other philosophers. From his synthesis of many points of philosophic view comes the richness, the variety, the depth, and the scope of Plato's philosophy. The major line that Plato's synthesis takes is to show that Heraclitus and Parmenides were on the wrong track in supposing that one or the other, either flux or permanence must be true of all of reality. Reality, says Plato, is not all of one piece, of one nature. Reality is not monistic, that is, characterized by a single unitary quality, such as flux. Reality, Plato urges, must be seen to be twofold, dualistic in its nature. Plato offers a dualistic metaphysics. Metaphysics is the name for that branch of philosophy which reflects upon the nature of fundamental reality and asks, what are the characteristics, what is the true nature of reality? Plato's metaphysics claims that there are indeed two kinds of reality: the reality of physical objects in space and time, which are objects of the senses, and which are in flux, growing, decaying, coming into being, going out of being, changing, as Heraclitus' river does. Heraclitus was right, but only about one kind of reality, not about all reality. But there is also another kind of reality, the reality of pure, true concepts, pure forms or essences, which are objects of thought, like a triangle, and which are not in space and time. The idea or essence of a triangle, which includes, for example, the property that its internal angles add up to 180 degrees, this is a universal and unchanging and immutable truth. There is, says Plato, a realm of eternally true ideas such as this, which reason can know. This is the truth about the permanent and unchanging reality that Parmenides was talking about, but it is true only of one kind of reality. There is Parmenides' world of universal and unchanging truth, which is knowable by reason. And there is also Heraclitus' world of flux and change, of things perceived by the senses. But Plato does not give equal value to these two kinds of reality. He has, in fact, little use for change, for the repetitious changes of the physical world, or for the fickle changes of public opinion. Like Parmenides and Socrates before him, Plato values another kind of reality, the permanent and unchanging reality of ideas which are absolutely true and definable by reason. But this knowledge is not available to the ordinary person, but only to those of superior intelligence and education, and only those who have this knowledge are fit to govern. Plato illustrates his dualistic theory of reality by his famous allegory of the cave at the beginning of Book 7 of the Republic. Now then, says Socrates, as he introduces the allegory, imagine mankind as living in an underground cave which has a wide entrance open to the light. Deep inside are human beings facing the inside wall of the cave, with their necks and legs chained so that they cannot move. They have never seen the light of day or the sun outside the cave. Behind the prisoners a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way on which a low wall has been built, such as is used in puppet shows, as a screen to conceal the people working the puppets. Along the raised way there walk people carrying all sorts of things, which they hold so that they project above the wall, statues of men, animals, trees. The prisoners, facing the inside wall, cannot see one another, nor the wall behind them on which the objects are being carried. All that they can see are shadows of the objects that are being cast on the wall of the cave. The prisoners live all their lives seeing only shadows of reality, and the voices they hear are only echoes from the wall. But the prisoners cling to their familiar shadows and to their passions and prejudices, and if they were freed and able to turn around and see the realities which produce the shadows, they would be blinded by the light of the fire, and they would become angry, and they would much prefer to go back to their shadow world. But if one of the prisoners were freed and turned around gradually to see in the light of the fire the cave, his fellow prisoners, and the roadway on which the objects are being carried, and then if he were dragged up and out of the cave into the light of the sun, he would then see the things of the world as they truly are, and finally he would see the sun itself. What would this person think now of the life in the cave, and what people back there in the cave know of reality or of morality. And if he were to descend back into the cave, would he not have great difficulty in getting used to the darkness, so that he could not compete any longer with those who had never left the cave? And would he not be subject to their ridicule and their scorn and even their physical attack? In all the history of Western thought, the allegory of the cave is the allegory most often cited and discussed. But what is an allegory? An allegory is a kind of story in which what is talked about is being compared to something else which is similar. But what that something else is left unstated. An allegory is accordingly defined as an incomplete simile. The reader must complete what is similar to the events described. What then is the allegory of the cave to be compared with? The people living out their lives in semi-darkness, chained by their necks and legs, unable to turn around, never knowing that what they see before them on the wall of the cave are only shadows. They are in bondage, but unaware of it. They remain ignorant of themselves and of reality. The question tantalizes and torments us. What is the relevance of the allegory of the cave to our present world? With what in our lives may it be compared? Some interpretations of the allegory are specifically relevant to our own society and to the present time. First, the allegory of the cave may be interpreted as a devastating criticism of our everyday lives, as being in bondage to superficialities, to shadow rather than to substance. Truth is taken to be, now, whatever is known by the senses. A good life is usually taken to be one which satisfies our desires. We are unaware that we are living with illusion, with false and superficial knowledge, and with false and conflicting ideals. Our lives are dominated by the shadow play on the walls of our cave, made by newspaper headlines, by radio broadcasts, by the endlessly moving shadows on the television screen, by the babel of echoing voices of opinion makers. The allegory of the cave may be taken also as, secondly, an equally devastating criticism of much of the science of our time, with its emphasis upon that which is known by the senses. Science, too, is chained so that it can see only shadows. The basis of science is in sensory observation. Its conclusions are only in the form of correlations of observations. Science does not venture into true causes or into long-range consequences. The empirical scientist is not so different from the winner on TV quiz shows who knows the dates of all the Humphrey Bogart films, nor is he so different from the prisoners in the cave who excel in identifying the sequence of shadows on the wall. It is a criticism also of our scientific technology and industry, developing and producing to meet superficial needs without regard for our true needs, without regard for moral or environmental considerations. Thirdly, the allegory of the cave may be interpreted as a political allegory. The life in the cave is the life of politics. Both the leaders and the people are ignorant and corrupt, without true knowledge of themselves or of the world. They are motivated by greed, power, and self-gratification. They are chained in bondage to ignorance and passions, to mob hysteria for or against fleeting issues, believing in current ideologies, which happen to be the illusions, the shadows of the moment on the walls of the cave. And fourthly, the allegory of the cave may be seen to be an allegory of the philosopher king, the liberated one. Having made the ascent to know the truth and the good, he has a mission to return to the cave, to bring enlightenment, to bring the good news, the glad tidings, even though he may be killed for his services. Plato is thinking of Socrates. We think of Jesus. For Plato, those who have completed the ascent of the divided line of knowledge are thereby alone fitted to govern, to be the philosopher kings of society, to be its guardians. But here, suddenly, the allegory of the cave comes into conflict with contemporary views of ourselves, the world, and politics. On this point, we cannot say, of course, this is the way it is with us. The allegory applies to us, however painfully. Two questions are at issue here. First, is there, as Plato believes, a single, absolutely true, immutable, and eternal concept of justice, of virtue, of the ideal society, of the ideal human being? And are these concepts such that only a few persons of superior intelligence can be educated to know them? Plato's answer is, of course, yes. Second, the second problem: would this knowledge justify political absolutism, an authoritarian government ruled with absolute unchecked power by this elite of intelligence and virtue? This would be in total opposition to democracy, which is government by the many with checks and balances. Plato answered yes to both questions. This was Plato's solution to the intellectual and moral decay of his time: an authoritarian government by a small elite educated to true knowledge and virtue, which are fixed in their essences for all time. After Plato's time, the rest of the history of Western philosophy struggles with these two questions, and for the most part, as most people do today, answers no. We do not claim to have knowledge of the absolute meaning of truth or justice or morality, nor do we believe that if we had such knowledge, it would justify a political absolutism of unchecked absolute political power. Finally, for us, as for Plato, the allegory of the cave is an allegory of despair and hope. Like Plato, we live in a time of loss of meaning and commitment, a time of crumbling standards of truth and morality, of corruption in political life, and decline in personal integrity. This is our despair. But there is a hope that we share with Plato's allegory, the hope of ascending to truth and values which are at least the best that we can know as guides to the good life. For us, as for the prisoner freed from his chains, the first step is to recognize illusions for what they are, the current flickering shadows on the wall of our cave.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.
The allegory of the cave, of humanity being chained in darkness, knowing only shadows on the wall, wheeling and dealing, living out their lives in ignorance and corruption, has haunted the minds of the Western world for 2,000 years. One interpretation of the allegory that Plato himself was anxious to have you make is that it is an allegory of education, and that the key to the allegory is that the ascent out of the cave of ignorance and degradation is by education to the truth. But what then is the true knowledge which is only to be found by the ascent from the cave to the light of the sun? Plato offers his theory of the nature of knowledge in the Republic from section 509 to the end of Book 6. Socrates is represented as conversing at this point with Glaucon, one of Plato's brothers. And to illustrate his theory of knowledge, he gives directions for a seemingly simple diagram. Take a line divided into two unequal parts. one to represent the visible order, the other the intelligible, and divide each part again in the same proportion. With these words, Plato introduces his famous figure of the divided line of knowledge, which is his effort to present his theory of knowledge diagrammatically, as the cave presented it allegorically. A vertical line is divided into 4 segments, each of which, from the lowest to the highest, represents a level of knowledge. Each level of knowledge, conjecture, belief, understanding, reason, has its own objects and its own method for knowing them. The basic division, however, is between knowledge, whose objects are in the intelligible world, and opinion, whose objects are in the visible world. And now to examine the divided line and its levels of knowledge in some detail. Conjecture, or imagining, represents the lowest rung on the ladder formed by the divided line of knowledge. Its objects yield the lowest degree of truth. It is the level of knowledge in which mental activity is at a minimum, as in the awareness of shadows, reflections in water, or in mirrors, or in smooth, shiny surfaces, or after images. Other examples of the level of conjecture are optical illusions, dream images, fantasies, soft borderline appearances at the point of waking or of falling asleep. But Plato's references to shadows and to images and illusions are rich with many implications. Plato is saying many things at once here. He is saying that the awareness of images is the lowest level of knowledge, since images are only shadows of the actual objects known by perception, which is a higher level of knowing than imagining, but is still only opinion, not knowledge. Plato seems to be alluding to artists whose paintings or sculptures are, as Plato sees them, only images, shadows, copies of actual human beings and other real objects. A still life painting of an apple is only an image of the actual apple. Painters, poets, sculptors, playwrights, whether of comedy or tragedy, are for Plato mere makers of images, fabricators of shadows and illusions, purveyors of make-believe, and Plato assigns them and their work to the lowliest level of the divided line of knowledge. Why does Plato so degrade and devalue the artist? Plato is suspicious of all forms of communication which use images, such as painting, poetry, plays, sculpture, since the masses in a democracy are easily influenced and controlled by persuasive imagery. What do you suppose Plato would have thought of television commercials, or of the slick paper magazine ads for sports cars, diamonds, and round-the-world ocean cruises? What would he have thought of our growing public relations industry, which is in the business of manufacturing images for its customers to present to the public? Plato also feared politicians as skillful image makers. He believed that the sophists, for their own political purposes, were teaching their clients a distorted image of the Athenian constitution, and thus they presented only a shadow, a blurred image of the actual constitution. At the present time, a good example of a mere shadow knowledge of our own constitution occurred in the responses to a recent questionnaire in which many people rejected as illegal a set of statements which turned out to be the Bill of Rights of the Constitution of the United States. The next level on the ascent of the divided line of knowledge is that of belief, which is the perception of actual objects. The level of belief is, first of all, the level on which there occurs the recognition of things, of three-dimensional objects, visible things like apples, people, stars, dogs, cities. This is the level of human knowledge at which the classification and organization of perceived objects begins. The actual things recognized are grouped together or classified insofar as they are similar, as apples are classified as Macintosh, Baldwin, Delicious, Rome, Stamen, and so forth. But knowledge at the level of belief does not grasp the abstract concepts of the objects which are perceived, does not grasp the botanist's concept of the apple, which identifies the unchanging characteristics of each species of apple. Belief, which has its source in the perception by the senses of actual objects, is thus insecure. It is not based upon abstract truths or principles which are unchanging, and which would give the farmer what the scientific botanist has: true knowledge on the basis of which he could rationally classify, predict, explain, and systematize what he knows. The point that Plato is trying to make us see is that perception of objects by the senses in the visible world can never give us true knowledge, and for two reasons. First, what can be known by the senses, he tells us, is only the world of flux, the world of Heraclitus, the world of particular things that are in the process of change. What we know at the level of belief is always subject to change, since we know only what we perceive in the visible world, which is the world of continual change. Since the features we perceive trees and horses and people and cities and chairs to have are continually changing, we can never be sure of our knowledge of them. We can only know how things seem to be on the basis of our perception of them, not how they actually are. In fact, says Plato, we do not have knowledge at this level, but only opinion. It is, however, true opinion, since it does recognize actual objects and does provide rough classifications and rough predictions. Plato is saying that this is the level on which the common sense mind, the mind of the man in the street, operates. It is therefore to be distinguished from the level of conjecture, which knows only images and shadows, and which can only be called false opinion. Plato is also trying to give us a second reason that sense perception can never give us true knowledge. This second reason is that knowledge derived from the senses can never give us general, universal, unchanging, and abstract truths of the intelligible world. Rather, the senses can give us only particular, changing, and concrete observations of this house, that dog, that tree of the visible world. Plato is thus maintaining that sense perception, which is how we know on the level of belief, cannot give us certainty in knowledge or unchanging universal truths about reality. But certainty and universal truth about reality are precisely what true knowledge must provide. What then is true knowledge? And how can true knowledge be reached? The pressure of these questions is now intensifying for Socrates' friends, Glaucon and Adeimantus, as Plato describes the mounting tension of the ladder of knowledge. And we too feel this tension as we climb the ladder and look back at the world of everyday beliefs based on unexamined common sense experience of how things seem. Even farther down below us now is the world of mere images, shadows, and fantasies, the world of powerful but deceptive illusions fabricated by artists, poets, dramatists, myth makers, and political demagogues, con men, like the notorious sophists as Plato saw them. With Plato, we reject these lower levels of thinking and what they think about. And we reject the kind of life that is lived by human beings on these low levels of knowledge. And so we ascend to the third level of the ladder of knowledge, the level of rational understanding or intellect. The change is from belief in the concrete, changing, particular objects of perception to the rational understanding of abstract, unchanging, universal concepts, which are the objects known by intellect. Whereas the traditional farmer, on the level of belief, makes a rough classification of particular apples by perceiving their actual different shapes, sizes, colors, and textures, the scientific botanist has knowledge of the precise characteristics of each species of apple. Also, he has knowledge of the principles of morphology concerning the reproductive parts of the apple blossom, and he has knowledge of the principles of genetics concerning the genes of the different species of apples, and he has knowledge also of techniques for the improvement of the apple species. The change from the knowledge of the traditional unscientific farmer to the scientific botanist, this is the change we have brought about by ascending from belief to rational understanding. And in making this ascent to the third level of the ladder of knowledge, we have come now to grasp the significance of the divided line. For on the third level, on which we have now arrived, we have crossed over the major division of the divided line of knowledge. We have entered the intelligible world. We have left the cave of everyday beliefs and artistic fantasies, and we have struggled upward into the light of the sun. We have left behind the concrete objects of the visible world, the everyday objects of the prisoners in the cave. But what kind of objects are we ascending to in the light of the sun? What objects do we know by intellect when we cross over the line into the intelligible world? Plato's answer is that the objects which we know by intellect or rational understanding on the third level of knowledge are the true concepts to which we have already made reference in contrast to the objects of belief. We have already noted that whereas the objects of perception are concrete, the objects of intellect are abstract. Whereas the objects of perception are particular things, the objects of intellect are general or universal concepts. And whereas the objects of perception are changeable, in process, in Heraclitean flux, the objects of intellect are unchanging, in Parmenidean eternal immutability. Plato has a special name for such concepts. He calls them forms or ideas. But how do such concepts give us true knowledge? What is their relation to the concrete objects of perception? How many such concepts are there? How can we know them? How can we prove that they are eternally true? In asking these questions, we have come face to face with Plato's famous theory of ideas, his famous theory of forms, which is his most creative and influential philosophical contribution, and is the central theme of his entire philosophy. Since we have crossed over into the intelligible world, whose objects are the forms, let us pause now before ascending to the highest levels of the divided line and examine the Platonic theory of forms. For Plato, concepts such as the concept of a circle, a triangle, beauty, justice, as well as the concepts that make up our everyday vocabulary, such as house, yellow, man, have two crucial functions. The first of these functions is that they make it possible for us to know the actual world of things, as well as the objects of mathematics and the sciences and philosophy. Their second function is that they enable us to evaluate and to criticize all these objects. First, how do abstract concepts enable us to have knowledge of all objects, the objects both of the visible world and of the intelligible world? Plato's point is that to think or to communicate at all requires the use of concepts. Concepts are the means by which the universe is made intelligible. The simplest statement, "There is a man," uses the concept man. "There is an apple," uses the concept apple. For anything that can be named, horse, triangle, man, justice, there is a concept, and to each concept there corresponds its eternal form. And now we can define an idea or form for Plato. Forms are the objective, universal, and immutable set of qualities which define concepts. More simply put, forms define our concepts. Forms or ideas are the eternal and immutable definitions of our concepts. For example, the form of the concept triangle is that it is a plane figure bounded by three intersecting lines with three internal angles whose sum is 180 degrees. This form is shared by the entire class of triangles, that is, by all the triangles that ever have been or will be drawn. Forms or ideas are the eternal and immutable, absolutely true definitions of our concepts, such as man, beauty, triangle. Forms specify the qualities which any particular man, any particular beautiful object, or any particular triangle must have in order to be considered a man, or beautiful, or a triangle. But also, the forms are real. They are independently existing entities. They have independent reality in the realm of the intelligible. As for particular things, such as men or triangles, they are real only to the extent that they measure up to the eternal truth of the form. Plato sometimes speaks of the forms as essences, meaning that they constitute the essence or essential substance of things. We can now understand that the forms or ideas are not mere ideas for Plato. They are not subjective. They are not merely mental entities confined to human minds. By idea, we ordinarily mean any particular thing we think of, something in my consciousness, something private to my mind. Just the contrary of this, the forms are no mere ideas or mental entities for Plato. Of all the components that make up reality, the forms have the greatest claim to reality, are the most real for Plato. They are the essential substance of any reality, of whatever is real enough to be thought about. The changing things of the visible world relate to the immutable forms of the intelligible world as imperfect copies of the forms. We can see now how it is that the forms make true knowledge possible. As we have already discovered, true knowledge must meet two requirements. It must be immutable, unchanging, and unchangeable, and it must be about what is real. Knowledge based upon sense perception, at the level of belief, was, we found out, neither unchanging because of its insecurity, nor about the real, since it was knowledge about the flux. By contrast, knowledge based upon the forms will be immutable and unchanging, since the forms are immutable. And knowledge based upon the forms will be knowledge of the real, since the forms constitute essential reality. And now briefly to examine the second function of the forms, that is, their evaluative and critical function. The pure and eternal forms define our concepts. By the same token, they establish standards or ideals by which to evaluate the world of things and flux. In the world of flux, things are always in a state of change. They are coming into existence or passing away. And the qualities of the forms, for example, the case of the apple, are very imperfectly copied in the concrete worm-holed apple. Similarly, no actual lines that we can draw will meet the standard of the form equality. No two lines in the visible world are ever perfectly equal. Nothing in the visible world is ever perfect in its kind. Only the pure, intelligible, immutable forms which establish the qualities defining each specific concept, whiteness, justice, circle, triangle. Only the pure forms are perfect. As we shall see, Plato will make his most striking use of the evaluative or normative function of the forms with regard to the ethical and political forms of goodness and justice. Whereas to most of us, as to the sophists, justice is relative, on Plato's theory of forms, the form of justice is, like all other forms, immutable and eternal. Would a present-day socialist or communist accept this? And now to return to the ladder of knowledge. The third level of knowledge is, as we have already seen, the level of rational understanding or intellect. Plato was here describing the kind of knowledge which characterizes mathematics and the sciences. The objects of the mathematician's knowledge are forms, forms such as triangles, circles, and other mathematical objects. These forms are known by the mathematician's rational understanding or intellect, and they are objective, universal, and immutable. These forms are unchanging and eternal. The area of a circle is always pi r squared. But the mathematician's knowledge does have deficiencies. It is still tied to the visible world by its use of diagrams in the proofs of geometry, the well-known figures of squares, triangles, circles. A second limitation of knowledge at this level is that it does not examine or prove its own assumptions, and thus this knowledge remains hypothetical or conditioned, rather than being based upon first principles which are proven to be true. Natural sciences, like mathematics, have as their objects the forms with which these sciences deal. For example, Plato thought, the forms of earth, air, fire, water. And although the natural sciences, like mathematics, provide knowledge of the forms, both mathematics and the sciences are limited in three respects. They rest upon unexamined first principles, they are tied to examples, particulars, instances from the visible world, and they are piecemeal, fragmentary. They fail to show the relations of the sciences to one another. We ascend now to the fourth and highest level of knowledge, pure reason. On this level, the mind uses the method of dialectic, which in this context means the science which studies the forms. Dialectic has been called the crowning science of all sciences. Here the true philosopher has come into his own realm. He moves toward knowledge of the forms by the activity of his reason, and through the use of dialectic as his method, the method of analyzing the essences or forms of all things in the universe, and seeing their relationship to one another. And in the dialogue called the Symposium, Plato shows that the philosopher moves toward the eternal and pure forms out of the power of his love, desire, eros, which leads him from the love of a beautiful body to the love of all beautiful things, and then to the love of the beauty of the mind as greater than the beauty of the body. And drawing toward and contemplating the vast sea of beauty, Plato says, at last the vision is revealed to him of a single science, which is the science of beauty everywhere. So in the Republic, the philosopher uses dialectic to take up the unfinished task of the third level of knowledge, and establishes on the fourth level true first principles for mathematics and for the sciences, without employing diagrams or particular things from the visible world. Secondly, dialectic unifies the isolated, fragmentary, unrelated sciences and mathematics into a single systematic unity. And thirdly, dialectic identifies the entire range and variety of forms, from forms of lowly things such as apples and dogs, relations such as equality and similarity, artifacts, man-made things such as beds and chairs, values such as beauty and goodness and justice. By the power of dialectic, the philosopher not only identifies all these forms and establishes their truth, but dialectic also organizes all the forms into a single, rational, structured order of truth and value. The forms constitute a hierarchical structure, a pyramid, from the many least universal to the few most universal, from the most concrete to the most abstract, from the forms of mud and dirt to the forms of identity and difference. And finally, in the ascent to the truth, the philosopher, by the power of love of the good, transcends this rational pyramid, this ordered structure of the hierarchy of forms, and reaches the idea of the good. Plato compares the idea of the good to the sun, whose light makes the concrete things of the world visible, and so is the source of their life and growth and value. In the idea of the good, Plato has given expression to a vision of an absolute source of truth and goodness. The idea of the good is the source of the truth and value of all the other ideas or forms. The idea of the good is the source of the world's moral purpose. With the ascent to the idea of the good, an absolute one of truth and goodness, Plato prepared the way for the Christian God. Like the God of Christianity, the idea of the good is the supreme value. It is the source of all value. The idea of the good is Plato's conception of the absolute, the perfect principle of all reality and of all value and of all truth. For 1,000 years, when Christians thought of God, they envisaged the ascent through the power of reason and the power of love to Plato's idea of the good.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.
In the second book of the Republic, Plato describes Glaucon as saying to Socrates, "The universal voice of mankind is always declaring that justice and virtue are honorable, but full of grief and hardship, and that the pleasures of vice and injustice are easy to attain and are only condemned by law and opinion. That the just and righteous suffer and the wicked prosper is the age-old complaint of the human race." What will be Plato's answer to this challenge, made not only in his time, but through the ages? We know that he will rise to the defense of justice. But what does he mean by justice? And how good is his answer to the complaint that the life of the person who seeks to live by justice and virtue is rewarded by grief and hardship? His answer takes off from his theory of forms, his central theory, in which the world of true reality is the world of unchanging and indestructible forms, the world in which everything that can be named, everything for which there is a concept, is represented by its eternal form. The theory of forms refuted and rebuked the sophist skepticism about whether true knowledge is possible at all. In opposition to the sophist skepticism about the very possibility of knowledge, as we have seen, Plato pointed to the absolutely certain knowledge of the eternal forms, triangle, circle, angle, which is provided by geometry, a knowledge which is absolutely true and absolutely certain. The absolutely true and the perfect form corresponding to each of our concepts is knowable by training, according to Plato, and study on the topmost rungs of the ladder of knowledge. Plato also rejects the sophist's insistence that all standards of justice, morality, and beauty are merely relative to time, place, social group, or even to the individual. Thus, they argued, Spartans are committed to the standards of authoritarianism and militarism. Athenians are committed to the standards of democracy. In opposition to this relativism on the part of the sophists, Plato argues that moral forms such as courage and justice and beauty are knowable as absolute and eternal truths exactly as the forms of geometry or astronomy, as circles and stars are known by sufficient education and training. Plato argues that the form of justice is an absolute standard by which human beings and governments in the visible world may be judged. Notice what is at stake here. The sophists may again be seen to represent a position much more widely held in our own time than is the position held by Plato. The sophists are very close to the contemporary point of view, which is called cultural relativism. Cultural relativists argue that every society, every primitive tribe, and every advanced civilization must be seen to be unique, one of a kind, each an organic totality, having its own unique history, its own language, institutions, its own education, family, its own modes of production and trade, its own religion and philosophy. It follows then that no outside standards can be used to evaluate any society. No absolute or universal standards of what a culture ought to be like or ought not to be like can be applied. Then it also follows that no culture can be compared with any other with respect to their meeting standards of human rights or of physical health or mental health or education or the quality and amount of cruelty that is practiced within the society or the satisfaction of felt human needs or the degree of democratic participation in decisions which affect the individual. For the sophists and for present-day cultural relativists, there are no universal standards for any of these issues, and therefore no culture can be judged better or worse than another for its performance on any of them. Athens is therefore no better than Sparta, but only different, the product of a different set of circumstances. Each culture evolved in its own way, in its own region, and in its own time. This point of view is appealing for its tolerance of every kind of society. It is also appealing for not being judgmental, as some of its defenders like to say. But there are obvious drawbacks to cultural relativism. The principal drawback was writ large, as Plato would say, when the cultural relativists of the United States had to face the rise of Nazi Germany and the hideous cruelties of the work camps and the extermination camps in which millions of human beings were tortured and murdered. But according to the position taken by cultural relativism, no judgment could be passed on the Nazis. No external, universal, or absolute standard could be applied to this unique German culture, which had evolved in its own way with its own standards and values. But in opposition to cultural relativism, the voice of humanity cried out in judgment against the Nazis that this was a culture which had sunk to the depths of evil and had brought hell to earth. Over 2,000 years ago, Plato was attacking the sophists for being cultural relativists, for failing to recognize that human beings share universal human standards, such as that of justice and human rights, and that thus human beings have a moral responsibility to criticize, to judge, to speak out wherever the universal and absolute standards of justice are denied or violated or withdrawn. Perhaps the case for Plato against the sophists looks good to you at this point. But let us now ask, what does Plato discover the form of justice to be? What is justice? This, of course, is the dynamic center of the entire dialogue, the entire republic. The problem of justice, the truly just government, the just society. This was present to Plato's consciousness, as we have seen, from his earliest childhood, in an aristocratic family which had lost much of its status and power to the new democratic government of Athens. Was that justice? Again, the long war with Sparta had raised the question of justice as between democratic Athens and authoritarian Sparta. And now the last blow, the Athenian government's putting Socrates to death. Could this be endured as justice? Long before he wrote it down in the Republic, Plato was committed to rejecting democracy and to holding the view that not until democracy came to an end, not until philosophers became kings or kings became philosophers, would a society based upon justice be possible. But this leaves the question, what is the eternal and unchanging and absolutely true form or idea or essence of justice? The philosopher king must be guided by justice. And as you note, in Book 1 of the Republic, Plato introduces the idea of justice. In the very first book, he sets out to show what is wrong with various commonly held beliefs about justice, and especially to refute the sophist view of justice. In Book 1, 4 views of justice are given. First presented is the view of Cephalus, the elderly, conventional, decent businessman, who, when asked by Socrates, "What is justice?" replies from the perspective of the businessman, reflecting upon justice in the daily transactions in the business world. Justice, says Cephalus, is speaking the truth and paying one's debts. Now, this may represent a simple version of the creed of the businessman, to speak the truth about your merchandise and pay your debts to your suppliers of inventory. Socrates happily demolishes this definition. Socrates does so by the familiar device of Socratic method, namely the counter-example, the example which the definition does not fit. Would it be just for you, he says, to pay your debt to a madman? What if you owed him a weapon which he gave you at a previous time when he was sane? Would it be just, Socrates presses Cephalus, to tell the insane man where he could find his enemy in order to kill him with a weapon you repaid to him? Cephalus has been made a monkey of. He is shown to be far down the ladder of knowledge from a knowledge of the form justice. He is on the level of belief, of common sense, of the everyday babble in the cave. The second definition of the term justice, Socrates elicits from Cephalus' son, Polemarchus, who is one of the group of wealthy young men who gather about Socrates and hang out with him in Athens. Polemarchus offers the view that justice is giving every man his due, being a friend to your friends and an enemy to your enemies. Socrates demolishes Polemarchus' definition of justice by pointing out that surely a just man would not favor a friend unless the friend were doing something honorable, nor would a just man do harm to anyone. And so the path is cleared now for Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a sophist, and he defies all conventional views of justice, such as being honorable in business, or helping friends and hurting enemies. Thrasymachus flatly denies that the laws of the state or the morality of individual persons have anything to do with justice. What the strong wish becomes law, says Thrasymachus. As for the laws of any state, their justice is actually nothing but the interests of the ruler, the interests of the stronger. And as for the morality of the individual man, the individual person who abides by the laws of his society is merely conforming in blind and docile obedience to laws that do not protect him, but protect the powerful. Laws serve the strong, says Thrasymachus, and conforming to the laws is the morality of the weak, who do not recognize, foolishly, that the laws do not benefit them and are not in their interests, but serve and benefit only the ruler. Socrates next disposes of Thrasymachus's claim that might makes right. This is a form of ethical relativism, which holds that the morally right is relative to whomever is the more powerful in any situation. Socrates argues that Thrasymachus's position implies that the ruler is infallible in always achieving his own gratification, his own benefit. But if the ruler makes a mistake and rules in a way that benefits his subjects, is he then just? Socrates also argues that if the ruler is a real craftsman in ruling, he will seek to benefit his subjects, not himself. And again, Socrates comes back and attempts to compare the ruler to the physician, who seeks to benefit the human body primarily, although secondarily the physician does take a fee. And so the ruler seeks to benefit his subjects first and himself second. But Thrasymachus is not silenced. He is by no means satisfied that Socrates has succeeded in refuting his views. And at the end of the dialogue, that is, at the end of Book 1, Socrates is still trying to defend justice as what the wise ruler and the wise man practice. But what the form of justice actually is, how to define justice, still eludes Socrates. What would justice mean in Plato's philosophy, now that what we have seen its central doctrine is the theory of forms? What Plato has offered us is a view in his theory of forms of all kinds of things, from the lowliest mud to the highest heavenly star. Each kind of existing thing has its own form or essence, which defines and sets the ideal for its nature. For Plato, any kind of being, a star, a dog, a man, is just or has virtue, is excellent, insofar as it functions according to its essence, according to the ideal set by its form or essence. In order to know what is just or virtuous or excellent or right for man, therefore, we must find out what is the essence, form, constitution, idea of man. And with the guidance of Plato, what we discover about the nature of human beings is that man, the form man, is not a simple form or simple essence, but is instead constituted by various elements in accordance with the various natural capacities and functions of a human being. The specific functions which man has, which distinguishes him from other living beings, is his power to use language and to reason. His other two elements are his appetites, his desires, his bodily needs, and a spirited element expressed in emotions such as anger, ambition, loyalty, and aggression. Of these three elements, it is the capacity to use language and to reason which is of greatest importance in the essence or form of man, and which therefore ranks supreme. The three elements of the form man fall into a natural hierarchy, a graded structure in which the rational element is the highest in power and in the capacity for truth and in value. The bodily appetites are at the bottom level of the hierarchy, and the intermediate level is occupied by the spirited element. Here we have the outline of what is known as Plato's tripartite theory of the self, or the soul, or the human psyche. Justice or virtue or excellence for a man is, as for all other things, to function in accordance with its essence. Justice or virtue for a human being is thus to function in accordance with an essence which Plato has discovered to consist of three distinct elements, which form a hierarchical structure from the lowest, bodily desires, to the highest, which is reason. And in Book 4, paragraphs 443 to 444, Plato draws out his theory of the tripartite nature of the human soul. Implicit in Plato's account of the three elements which together constitute the human soul is the insight that Plato has into psychological conflict. Here he has gone far beyond Socrates' simple doctrine that virtue is knowledge, that if we truly know the good, we will act in accordance with it. What Plato sees instead is that although reason may know the good, the element of reason runs into conflict with the bodily appetites and with physical desires. In the familiar scenario of the Hollywood Western, the cowboy in the saloon is pulled in one direction by his desires for the pretty waitress and for the alcoholic beverages she is conning him into drinking. But his reason pulls him in the opposite direction by telling him that he is now getting into big trouble. Since human beings have a tripartite soul, says Plato, the highest good for humans cannot be pleasure, since pleasure would be the result of satisfying only the bodily appetites, which constitute only one of the three elements of the soul. The human being's highest good must be the sense of well-being or happiness which comes from functioning in accordance with its nature, from fulfilling the needs of all three elements which make up the form of what it is to be a person, with reason having primacy in governing spirit and bodily appetites. The complex nature of a human being can be fulfilled. And when each element of the self functions in this way, in accordance with its appropriate role in the structured self, the life of such a person may be said to be just, and he experiences this justice of the soul, this integration of his personality, as well-being or as happiness. Morality, Plato is telling us, consists in knowing and maintaining the harmony and balance between the rational and the irrational elements of the soul. This balance or harmony in the soul is the justice of the soul's morality or virtue or excellence, and its product is happiness. Plato thought of the self or soul not merely as a hierarchical order or structure, but as an organism as well. In a healthy, living organism, the parts are in harmonious interdependence. Each part has a function which serves the whole organism, and the various parts are in an ordered structure of importance to the life of the organism, with the heart and liver, for example, having essential functions which, for example, the appendix does not. The dysfunctions or malfunctions of any part of the organism have adverse effects upon the rest. So in the soul, the dysfunction or malfunction of any of the three elements will drain out of the soul its sense of well-being. For Plato, it is clear that neither a life devoted exclusively to bodily pleasures, nor a life devoted ascetically to the denial of any bodily pleasures would be functional. Moreover, Plato is very well aware of how much capacity there is in the human soul for ill health, for inner conflict and misery. If we take a closer look at the three elements of the soul, we find that the lowest element in the hierarchy of the soul consists of the bodily appetites such as hunger, thirst, and sex. Reason is the drive or need to analyze, explain, reach the truth of the forms, to know what is good for man and society, and ultimately to know the idea of the good itself, the ultimate source of all truth and goodness, and to guide one's life by this knowledge. But these two elements come into conflict, since human nature desires truth, but also struggles against it. While the irrational appetites pull us toward their gratification, reason acts as an inhibiting principle, as Plato tells us in paragraphs 434 to 436. The third and intermediate element, the high-spirited part of the self, consists of such emotions as anger, pride, aggression, and loyalty. This element serves as mediator between the other two. It is capable of acting on behalf of either reason or the appetites. The key to mental health and to morality or justice is the proper integration of these potentially conflicting parts of the self. The problems that reason has in mastering the appetites and the spirited element are illustrated unforgettably by Plato in another dialogue, the Phaedrus. in which he presents the figure of a man in a chariot, driving two horses. One horse is good, needs no touch of the whip, and is guided only by the charioteer's voice. The other horse is bad, uncontrollable by the whip, keeps trying to plunge off and run away. The charioteer, pulling at the two horses, each rushing in different directions, portrays the three conflicting elements of personality and their potential for producing disorder, extreme conflict, and finally breakdown. And in another section of the Republic, Plato compares the element of reason to a man, the spirited element to a lion, and the bodily appetites to a many-headed dragon. The problem, which Plato then states, is this: how to persuade the lion to help the man to keep the dragon of desire in check. In the just, moral, or sane personality, reason rules, and when it is thus fulfilling its function to master the other elements of the soul, reason exhibits its proper virtue, which is wisdom. In the same way, when the spirited element performs its aggressive and defensive functions within the limits set by the requirements of the soul, it exhibits its proper virtue, which is courage. One can be courageous in love, in war, in intellectual or athletic competition, and in all the great conditions of stress that occur to human beings. And finally, when the appetites perform their own functions appropriately, they exhibit their characteristic virtue, which is temperance, keeping within bounds, keeping the passions within limits. Although all human beings are constituted of these three elements, humans vary according to which element is dominant in their personalities. Not all personalities are dominated by reason. There are three kinds of personalities, according to Plato. Each is dominated by a different element, the fulfillment of which is their goal, their purpose in life. There is, first of all, the type which is dominated by reason, the personality whose main desire is for knowledge and truth. Then there is the type dominated by the spirited element, who lives only for success or for public acclaim. And finally, there is the type of personality dominated by the appetites, who lives, says Plato, only for money. The most famous tripartite theory of personality to appear after Plato is that of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, whose famous id, ego, and superego constitute, for him, the tripartite structure of personality. As with Plato, Freud's tripartite theory stresses the necessity of harmonious interdependence of the parts of the personality for the good of the whole. But on the other hand, Freud also stresses the potential for much conflict between the three elements. We may compare Freud's concept of the id, which is the seat of the sexual and aggressive drives, or instincts, and which is also the seat of hunger, thirst, and other self-preservative instincts. We might compare Freud's id to Plato's bodily appetites. However, there are very basic differences between the two tripartite theories, some of which we may mention now. Freud demotes aggression, which is for Plato an aspect of the spirited element. Freud demotes aggression to being merely one of the drives or instincts, whereas Plato, on the other hand, had given aggression a more honorable status as a spirited element, thus revealing, on Plato's part, the importance of war and of aggression in the Greek world, and thus revealing the honorable status which Athenians gave to their warriors. Other big differences between the two tripartite theories of Plato and Freud are that Freud breaks reason into two parts, ego and superego. Freud gave to ego reason's functions of perception and intelligence, Freud gave to superego reason's functions of moral judgments and of knowledge of the good. Those elements of reason which Freud incorporated into the ego are no longer master, but only mediator between id and superego for Freud. And Freud has made notorious throughout the Western world the endless conflicts between the desires of the id, both sexual and aggressive, and, on the other hand, the punitive superego, which is constantly watching and condemning these instincts, even when they are only unconscious impulses. Surely Freud knew Plato's tripartite theory. Surely he knew it so well that on 2 occasions Freud used Plato's own figure of the unruly and uncontrollable horse. In relationship to the id, the seat of sexual and aggressive desires, said Freud, the ego, the seat of reason, is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. And now we turn to Plato's political philosophy, where, as he says, the form of justice is written in large letters. We turn from justice in the soul to justice in the state.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.
One of the most striking social phenomena of the recent past was the byproduct of a leading national magazine. Have you ever fantasized becoming a playboy or a playgirl, luxuriating in resort hotels in the company of this month's centerfold sex symbol? Why not the playboy life, the hedonic life in which pleasure is pursued as the highest good, the life of pleasurable indulgences in food and drink and sex and drugs and sleep and all the titillations of the body that we can experience? Plato answers this question over and over again in subtly different ways. His point is always that pleasure is not the highest good for humans because, says Plato, the highest good for anything, human or non-human, consists in fulfilling its own nature, in living up to its own nature, its own form or essence. And my nature as a human being does not consist only in my bodily appetites, but it consists also in the other 2 parts of the tripartite form of the self. My spirited element of aggressive, ambitious, courageous, self-assertive, and patriotic emotions and traits, and also in my rational element, my powers of speech and reason. My highest good, my moral good, requires that I fulfill all 3 parts of myself in accordance with their proper harmony or order. Their proper order is a hierarchy, with reason as the highest, most worthy element, the bodily elements the lowest, and the spirited traits intermediate between them. The just man, says Plato, does not allow the several elements in his soul to usurp one another's functions. Rather, Plato continues in a famous line, the just man sets his house in order, so that the bodily appetites do not take over the ruling position that reason should have. The good life, according to Plato, is the balanced life, and it delivers human happiness and a sense of well-being of the whole person. The body must be satisfied and be healthy, strong, and beautiful. Ambition, aggression, self-assertion, loyalty, the sense of honor, these spirited energies must drive the self to activity and achievement, but must be directed and controlled by reason. And finally, the good life, as Plato describes it, is sometimes called the life of reason. But Plato does not mean that the good life is that of the narrowly over-intellectualized person lacking in spirit and without a strong, healthy body. The good life is not the life of reason alone, but only of the dominance of reason. And thus to the question, why not live the life of pleasure? Plato answers with his own formulation of the Greek ideal of the development of human beings who are excellent in mind, body, and character. Western civilization has been in love for more than 2,000 years with the Greek ideal of the good life, and with Plato's version of the good life as the life of balanced fulfillment of our complex human nature, the life of reason, appetites, and spirit, the life of healthy, honorable, intelligent happiness under the sun, which is the symbol of the idea of the good, the perfect principle of truth and beauty and goodness. This, then, is Plato's moral philosophy, or his ethics. Moral philosophy or ethics may be defined as the branch of philosophy which studies the nature of good and evil, right and wrong, duty and obligation. Moral philosophy or ethics ask questions such as, is there a highest good, an absolute good for human beings? Or, as the sophists argued, are all goods relative to time and place, to history and to culture? Is the good knowable? Is the good rational, or is it merely the voice of the spirited and bodily passions? Is the highest moral good the achieving of happiness, or is it the performing of one's duty? We have seen that Plato does indeed affirm a highest good for man, and that it is absolute, eternal, and immutable, and it is knowable and rational. For Plato's ethics, for Plato's moral philosophy, what then is the highest good? For Plato, the highest good for human beings is the happiness or well-being which comes from the fulfillment of the three parts of the soul under the rule of reason. And for Plato's ethics, what then is virtue? Virtue, or the right conduct of life, is action which flows from knowledge of the tripartite soul, from knowledge of all the forms and the idea of the good. Only the few have such knowledge, and they therefore should rightfully control the conduct of all the other members of society. And so the heart of Plato's view of virtue is still Socrates' original statement that virtue is knowledge. Plato tells us that if we want to see personal morality more clearly, we must turn to the state, where Plato says it is writ large for us to see. Problems of the state form the topic to which the Republic is principally dedicated, the problems of political philosophy. Political philosophy may be defined as the branch of philosophy which studies such problems as, what is the good society? What is justice? In whom ought control to be vested? What is the relation of subordination, superordination between the state and the individual? Does the state exist to serve the individual, or does the individual exist to serve the state? Plato's political philosophy answers these questions by building upon his ethics, his moral philosophy. Now, his moral philosophy has already established the form of justice in the human soul. The human individual is just or virtuous insofar as he or she lives in accordance with the harmonious structure of the three parts of the soul. But what does justice in an individual person have to do with the state? What is justice in the state, which is the political organization of the city? A city, says Plato, is a man writ large against the sky. The elements that make up a city, he says, correspond to the elements of the individual human soul. And the justice or morality of the city is the same as it is for the individual. What then are the elements of the state that correspond to the elements of the tripartite soul? Like the individual human soul, with its three parts, every state of whatever type necessarily has three parts, he says, which are its three social classes: a producer class, a military or warrior class, and a governing or ruling class. And in the ideal city, the republic, which Socrates and his young disciples are designing, each of these three classes will perform a vital function on behalf of the organic totality, which is the society. The producer class will provide themselves and the other two classes with the necessities of life: food, shelter, clothing, trade, and commerce. The producer class is made up of farmers, herdsmen, blacksmiths, fishermen, carpenters, shipbuilders, shoemakers, weavers, laborers, merchants, retailers, and bankers. The producer class corresponds to the appetitive element, the element of appetites in the soul of the individual human being. As on the diagram you can see that the warrior, or the warrior class, which Plato also calls the auxiliaries, since they aid or supplement the work of the guardians, they correspond to the spirited element. And the rulers, sometimes called the guardians, correspond to the element of reason in the soul. The members of the producer class will be drawn from that type of person in whom the bodily appetites are dominant, and who live for money and what money can buy. The members of the ruling class will be drawn from that type of person in whom reason is dominant and who live only for truth. The warrior class will be drawn from that type of person in whom the spirited element is dominant and who lives for honor or for success in aggressive and courageous acts. Thus, each class in the state is parallel to a part of the soul and its function. The ruling class, dominated by reason, is at the top of the social order and directs and controls the two other classes. Strictly parallel to the justice of the soul is the justice of the state, in which each class performs its appropriate function harmoniously under the rule of the most rational. But why should the state be ruled by an elite group of the most rational? We who live in a democracy which traces its own roots back to Athenian democracy cannot help raising this question. Plato answers this question most forcefully in the dialogue called the Pythagoras. When you are in ill health, says Plato, you go to the most competent medical specialist, to the best expertise you can find. You don't ask everyone you meet on the street for advice. You don't take a vote among as many people as possible as to what your illness is or what to do about it. Why then, with regard to problems of the health of the state, problems of the body politic, problems of the utmost political importance, should we consult the advice, he says, of the ignorant many? Plato's point is that governing a society is a skill that requires specialized and intensive training, far greater than that required for the training of a shipbuilder, a shoemaker, or a physician. What then is the training that is necessary for those who would be capable of piloting effectively and wisely the ship of state? Plato's answer to this is his theory of the selection and education of the guardian or ruler class. How, first of all, are the members of the guardian class to be selected? Membership in the ruling class is by natural capacity of intelligence, by IQ, as we would say. Plato believed that heredity is the prime factor in intelligence, and that for the most part, the children of the most intelligent will also be of highest intelligence, and the children of those who have the natural capacity only to be shoemakers will, like their parents, have the natural capacity only to be shoemakers. But Plato was well aware of exceptions. Plato was very sensitive to problems of genetics, and therefore Plato decided that the ranks of the guardian class, the elite class of the intelligent, must be open to the children of all classes, and that throughout the Republic, in the early years of child development, all children in all classes must be kept under constant observation and testing in order to identify those children who are of sufficiently high intelligence to be trained for the guardian class. The selection of the guardians, then, is from all classes by natural intellectual capacity. And women as well as men, according to Plato, possess the natural capacity of intelligence to become members of the ruling class. Plato stands out in the history of Western philosophy as the first supporter, along with Socrates, of the intellectual equality of the sexes. Book 5 of the Republic has been hailed by the contemporary women's movement for its defense of the equality of the sexes. There is only one difference between men and women, Plato argues, and that is that males beget and women bear children. But this difference has no more to do with the capacity for functioning in the world or in the life of the city than the difference between being bald-headed or having hair. Women, like men, have the natural capacities which will fit some women for the ruler class, some women to be warriors and auxiliaries, some to be producers. Women in the Republic will therefore share in the life of all three classes. What a supporter of ERA Plato would have made. How then shall the philosopher kings be trained? Their training is by education and by the experience of service to the state. Education for those selected to be guardians begins as children with strictly censored music and literature for the mind and gymnastics for the strength and health of the body. In time they will then ascend on the divided line of knowledge to be trained in mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences whose objects are in the intelligible world. And by the age of 30, those who have successfully come through a series of competitive examinations and proven themselves to have the intelligence, the strength and balance of character, and the bodily vigor and stamina will have completed their education on the third level of the divided line. And now, for the last time, the group of candidates will again be weeded out, the ones remaining being eligible to advance now to the study of dialectic on the fourth and the highest level of knowledge, in which, by reason alone, the candidate for the guardian class will study and come to know the eternal truths which are the forms, each form in itself, and all in their interrelationships and totality. Finally, Plato says, the guardian attains at last to the absolute good by intellectual vision, and therein reaches the limit of the intellectual world. 5 years will be devoted to training in dialectic. At this point, when the candidates in training are now 35 years old, they will be sent down into the cave, says Plato, and compelled to hold any military or other post for which the young are qualified. The purpose of the return to the cave of political life from their years of study under the sun is to give them the experience of everyday politics and to see how well they handle various kinds of temptations. They will be required to spend 15 years in this probationary period. At the age of 50, those who have met this last test of intelligence and character will be admitted to the governing class. They will have become philosopher kings, with the responsibility of governing all the individuals in all classes, as well as their own lives, by the absolute truth and absolute good which they have learned through their long education in knowledge and virtue. What will their lives be like? Strenuously disciplined, sternly self-denying, yet totally inspired and dedicated to the task. Is there any training for rulership in our contemporary world like this, other than that within the Roman Catholic Church? Both the guardian class and the military class are forbidden by Plato to possess any private property or any money. They must live, men and women, like soldiers in barracks, with common meals and sleeping quarters. Their modest clothing and equipment will be provided by the producers. Their food must be restricted to moderate quantities. They are to have no family life in order to avoid any conflict between family loyalties and their loyalty to the state. The guardian's sexual gratification is also restricted while in the prime of life. to officially designated and infrequent occasions on which the guardians are required to mate in order to breed children to maintain the numbers of the guardian class. These are the occasions for what Plato calls sacred marriages, which are in fact temporary sexual unions for the sake of producing children for the guardian class. These marriages are far too important to permit them to be made on the basis of personal preference. Plato's plans for the breeding of the rulers of the Republic are utopian beyond anything foreseeable in our present society. Only our science fiction compares in boldness with Plato. Plato was thinking of breeding humans as scientifically and with as much care as his brother Glaucon breeds dogs, or as we breed racehorses or prize cattle. Would you be in favor of using our growing scientific knowledge at the present time of genetics to produce humans of superior mental and physical capacity? The very mention of such a proposal is terrifying to many people today. Plato had no such fears. Plato knew that the form of the human being required a standard of excellence in mind and character and body, and these were the very qualities he required for the guardian class. And so he has Socrates ask Glaucon in section 459 of the Republic. I see, Glaucon, you keep sporting dogs at your house. Do you breed from all indiscriminately? Are you not careful to breed from the best as far as you can, and from those in their prime? No less care than that will be devoted to breeding the guardians of the Republic. Who will mate with whom will be determined by the older guardians, and the best male guardians will be mated with the best female guardians. But the guardians will not know that their mates have been selected for them. To avoid their complaints, they will be told that the mating is by lottery. This is a lie, but it is what Plato calls a noble lie, a lie which is rationally justified for the good of the state. The children who will be born from these matings will be raised with exquisite care in a communal nursery. Mentally defective or physically deformed or defective infants born from these matings will be put away immediately to die in some unknown place. Is your moral sensibility revolted by this aspect of ancient Greek attitudes toward human life? Or do you agree with Plato and with many people today that in these cases infanticide is moral and can be made humane? By contrast with the severe discipline under which the guardian class lives, how easy the life of the producer class appears. Except for governmental regulations imposed by the rulers, the lives of the producers follow the old familiar patterns of home and property, family and children, work, rest, recreation, and the daily news. By nature, the producers love money and what money can buy. The many, says Plato in a famous phrase, love getting and spending. As anyone can plainly see who goes shopping on Saturdays, when after a week of working and getting, the producer class in the United States does its spending, packing the stores downtown and swarming over the suburban shopping centers. Plato planned governmental regulation of the accumulation of wealth in order to maintain economic moderation in the Republic. Plato was afraid that otherwise the cleverer producers will get richer and the rest poorer, and conflict would inevitably break out. But the Republic makes, in fact, the fewest demands for change upon the producer class. They alone, of all the three classes, can keep gold and silver, live in their nuclear family units, work for the most part at their traditional occupations, and they are free in their sexual activities. Each member of the producer class will be taught a trade or profession, farming, banking, carpentry, according to his or her own capabilities, and according to the needs of the society, both of which will be determined by the guardians. Since the producer class cannot grasp abstract concepts, education with respect to the forms would be wasted on them. But they must be given another type of education as well as learning their trade. They will be taught to learn to be virtuous producers. A state propaganda agency will indoctrinate the producers with respect and obedience for the guardians, with loyalty and patriotism to the Republic, and with strong work motivation. Music, stories of heroism, fables, and the graphic arts will all be used for purposes of indoctrination. And governmental censorship will also be required to monitor and censor legends, stories about the gods, poems, and plays. The guardians, after all, have the responsibility of protecting all the members of society from the insidious, demoralizing attractions of some of the artists, poets, dramatists, and musicians. Plato is morally opposed to the poet Homer portraying the gods as quarreling, telling lies, and seeking revenge. Plato also plans to censor slack and unmanly music. What would Plato have done with rock and roll, Elvis Presley style? In Book 3 of the Republic, Plato says that a young man should not be allowed to see a play in which violence seems to be commonplace. Plato would surely see the frequency of television violence as having this same effect. The nightly showing of violence sends a message to the audience that there is nothing surprising about violent assault or rape or homicide. In fact, it is quite commonplace, and so, in a sense, is acceptable. Would you agree? In the current debate over the influence of television violence on children, Plato would argue for censoring all violence, for adult viewing as well as for children, and for two reasons. One, that the frequency of television makes it a commonplace, television violence makes it a commonplace and therefore somewhat acceptable. And two, the frequency of television violence is a stimulus to some to perform the same violent acts in their own lives. Critics of Plato's Republic have accused it of being anti-democratic, which of course it is. Others have accused it of being communist. Still others have called it fascist. Is Plato a totalitarian in his politics? Totalitarianism is a type of 20th century politics which cannot meaningfully be used to describe the politics of the ancient Greek city-state in the 5th century before Christ. But in his political philosophy, Plato is a political absolutist, advocating the subordination of the individual to the state and vesting absolute and unchecked power in an elite group. But there are certain resemblances between Plato's political absolutism and totalitarianism of the 20th century. Like totalitarian governments, right-wing and left-wing, fascist and communist, Plato rejected individualism and democracy and argued for the subordination of the individual to the supremacy and power of the state. Like totalitarian governments, Plato denied individual rights, civil liberties, due process of the law, and he advocated government by an elite group with unchecked power, with state censorship, thought control by propaganda, state control of the economy, the intrusion of the state into almost all areas of the private life. But Plato would have detested modern totalitarianism, just as he detested Thrasymachus's philosophy that might makes right. For Plato, there is only one justification for his regimented absolutistic state, that it is founded on true knowledge, on the eternally true essence of justice. Any other justification for government, Plato would condemn as illegitimate. Government justified by power, race, wealth, aristocratic birth, the glorification of a social class, as in communism, or the glorification of a particular leader, as in fascism. Since Plato viewed his ideal republic as having absolutely true knowledge of the essence of justice, of a good society, and of a good human being, he believed that his republic is entitled to absolute power and complete responsibility for making its citizens virtuous and for controlling the entire society. Aha, I hear you say. Isn't that what all absolutist governments and churches have always said? Our knowledge of the truth justifies our absolute control over everyone. There are two challenges which must be made to Plato's Republic and to any other absolutist politics. First, are there, as Plato claims, absolutely true and unchanging forms of justice, human nature, society, and the good? Do you think that Plato has proved this? Second, Who guards the guardians? What is the guarantee that the rulers will not be corrupted by such absolute power? What provisions are made in the Republic for checking on the policies and activities of the guardians and for removing them from office if necessary? All the Western democracies have such safeguards against the abuse of power, but no absolutist church or state has such safeguards, and no totalitarian government has. Plato, as an absolutist, has failed us here. Despite these and other problems, the Republic of Plato stands forth for all time as the source of the rationalist tradition, the tradition of reason in Western civilization. Plato's Republic presents a philosophic vision of a realm of eternal truth and beauty and goodness above the flux of changing opinion. It is Plato's vision that through the human love of truth and through the power of human reason, we may yet come to know the true essences of all things and the idea of good itself, and with this knowledge, design and build an ideal society. This is the ancient and continuing promise of Plato's Republic.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.